Case 1. INOUE, May 2021, Maricopa County. It started as a welfare check that would become every first responder's nightmare. On a quiet Saturday morning in Tempe, Arizona, police arrived at an apartment complex after receiving a disturbing call. What they discovered inside would haunt them forever. 2 young children, a 7-year-old boy and a 9-year-old girl, brutally murdered with a meat cleaver. Their mother, INOUE, was found at the scene covered in blood. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual the night before. The apartment had been quiet, almost eerily so. But behind that silence, an unspeakable horror was unfolding. The children, whose names have been protected by authorities out of respect for surviving family members, were attacked while they slept. The violence was so extreme that responding officers required counseling afterward. INOUE, a Japanese national living in the United States, had shown no obvious signs of instability according to neighbors who knew the family. She appeared to be a devoted mother, often seen walking her children to and from school. But investigators would later uncover a different picture, one of mounting stress, potential mental health issues, and a mother spiraling toward an unthinkable act. During the investigation, detectives pieced together the timeline of that horrific night. INOUE had tucked her children into bed as she normally did, but something inside her had snapped. She retrieved a meat cleaver from the kitchen and returned to their bedroom. What happened next was a calculated, methodical attack on 2 defenseless children who trusted her completely. The crime scene was so disturbing that veteran homicide detectives later said it was among the worst they had ever processed. Blood spatter analysis revealed the children had tried to defend themselves, but they were no match for an adult wielding a deadly weapon. The medical examiner's report detailed multiple wounds on both victims, indicating a sustained and brutal assault. INOUE was arrested at the scene and initially appeared catatonic, barely responding to police questions. She was taken into custody and held without bond while prosecutors built their case. The evidence was overwhelming. Her fingerprints on the weapon, blood evidence throughout the apartment, and her own presence at the scene when police arrived. The case proceeded through the Maricopa County court system with unusual speed. INOUE's defense attorneys initially suggested mental illness might be a factor, but prosecutors argued that the calculated nature of the crimes indicated she knew exactly what she was doing. Expert witnesses testified about her mental state, but ultimately, the jury found her guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors pushed for the harshest possible penalty. They presented victim impact statements from family members who had lost 2 precious children to unimaginable violence. The children's father, who was not living with the family at the time of the murders, provided heartbreaking testimony about his loss and the permanent void left in his life. The judge, clearly moved by the brutality of the crimes and the vulnerability of the victims, sentenced INOUE to consecutive natural life terms without the possibility of parole. This meant she would spend the rest of her days in an Arizona prison, never eligible for release. The judge stated during sentencing that the crimes were among the most heinous he had encountered in his decades on the bench. INOUE showed little emotion during the sentencing hearing, maintaining the same detached demeanor she had displayed throughout the trial. Her lack of remorse troubled many observers and convinced the court that she posed a permanent danger to society. She was remanded to the Arizona Department of Corrections, where she remains today, serving her consecutive life sentences. The case sent shockwaves through the Tempe community and raised difficult questions about how such violence could occur without warning signs. Schools held counseling sessions for students who knew the victims. The apartment complex where the murders occurred saw many families move out, unable to continue living so close to where such horror had unfolded. For investigators, the INOUE case represented a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest danger to children comes from the person who should protect them most. It challenged assumptions about maternal instinct and forced professionals to confront the reality that evil can wear the face of a mother. Today, the case remains one of the most disturbing maternal murders in Arizona history. The 2 young victims are remembered by family members who struggle daily with their loss, trying to preserve happy memories while grappling with the violent way their lives ended. Justice was served in court, but for those who loved these children, no sentence could ever be enough. Case 2. Bachel Henry, January 2020, Maricopa County. The Phoenix Fire Department received a frantic call just after midnight. A woman was screaming that her children were not breathing. Paramedics rushed to the scene expecting a medical emergency, perhaps carbon monoxide poisoning or some tragic accident. Instead, they discovered 3 small children arranged on a couch, positioned as if they were sleeping peacefully. But they were not asleep. They were dead. The children, a 3-year-old girl, a 2-year-old girl, and a 7-month-old boy, had been suffocated by their own mother, Rachel Henry. The crime was so calculated and so cold that it initially seemed impossible to investigators. How could a mother methodically kill not 1, but 3 of her own children? Rachel Henry, only 22 years old at the time, had called emergency services herself after completing the murders. When police arrived, she was remarkably calm, showing none of the hysteria or grief one would expect from a mother who had just lost 3 children. This emotional disconnect immediately raised red flags for responding officers. During initial questioning, Henry's story began to fall apart. She first claimed she had found the children unresponsive, but forensic evidence quickly contradicted this narrative. The positioning of the bodies, the lack of any apparent medical distress, and physical evidence on the children themselves pointed to intentional suffocation. Under pressure from detectives, Henry eventually confessed to the killings. According to her confession, Henry had felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities of motherhood. She spoke of financial stress, relationship problems, and feeling trapped by the demands of caring for 3 young children. Rather than seek help or support, she made the unthinkable decision to eliminate what she saw as the source of her problems, her own innocent children. The method she used was particularly disturbing. One by one, she suffocated each child, then carefully arranged them on the couch to create the appearance they were simply napping together. This staging was a deliberate attempt to deceive first responders and buy herself time before the truth emerged. It demonstrated premeditation and a chilling awareness of what she had done. The Phoenix Police Department launched a thorough investigation, interviewing neighbors, family members, and anyone who had contact with Henry and her children in the days leading up to the murders. What emerged was a portrait of a young mother who appeared to be struggling, but who had not reached out for the abundant resources available to parents in crisis. Neighbors recalled seeing Henry with her children regularly. Some described her as seeming tired and stressed, but no one suspected the dark thoughts brewing in her mind. The children appeared healthy and well cared for on the surface, making the revelation of their murders all the more shocking to the community that knew them. As news of the triple murder spread through Phoenix, public outrage intensified. Vigils were held for the 3 young victims, whose lives had been stolen before they had a chance to truly begin. Teddy bears, flowers, and candles piled up outside the apartment where they died, a makeshift memorial to innocence lost. The legal proceedings moved forward quickly. Henry was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, each carrying the potential for life imprisonment. Her defense attorneys faced an almost impossible task. How do you defend someone who confessed to killing 3 helpless children? During the trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Henry's guilt. The confession, forensic evidence, and complete lack of any alternative explanation painted a damning picture. Defense attorneys attempted to introduce evidence of Henry's mental state and difficult personal circumstances, but the jury remained unmoved. Expert witnesses testified about child suffocation and the physical evidence found on the victims. Medical examiners explained how each child had died and approximately how long each would have suffered before losing consciousness. These details were heartbreaking for everyone in the courtroom to hear. The prosecution also presented evidence about resources that had been available to Henry. Social services, family support programs, and crisis intervention services were all accessible to her if she had only reached out. Her decision to kill rather than seek help demonstrated a fundamental moral failure that the jury could not overlook. When the guilty verdicts were read on all 3 counts, there was a collective sense of relief in the courtroom mixed with profound sadness. Justice was being served, but 3 children were still gone forever. No verdict could bring them back or undo the horror of what had happened to them. During sentencing, the judge addressed Rachel Henry directly, speaking about the sacred trust between parent and child that she had violated in the most extreme way possible. The judge described her actions as selfish, cruel, and utterly incomprehensible. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Henry would never walk free again. Henry showed more emotion during sentencing than she had throughout the rest of the proceedings, crying as she was led away to begin serving her sentence. Whether those tears were for her children or for herself remained unclear. She was transferred to the Arizona State Prison Complex, where she remains today. The case prompted renewed discussions about maternal mental health and the importance of identifying mothers in crisis before tragedy strikes. While Henry's case was extreme, it highlighted the need for better support systems and intervention strategies for struggling parents. For the Phoenix community, the wounds from this case remain fresh. 3 young lives were extinguished by the one person who should have protected them above all others. The tragedy serves as a stark reminder that evil can exist anywhere, even in the heart of a mother. Case 3. CONNIE Villa, December 2013, Pinal County. Christmas is supposed to be a time of joy, family togetherness, and celebration. But in Casa Grande, Arizona, Christmas Day 2013 became the darkest day imaginable for one family. What should have been a morning of opening presents and making memories became a nightmare when CONNIE Villa decided to murder her 13-year-old daughter and attempt to poison her other children. The day began normally enough in the Villa household. Children were excited about Christmas gifts, and the family was preparing for holiday activities. But CONNIE Villa had made a horrific plan that would shatter her family forever and shock the entire Casa Grande community. Villa's 13-year-old daughter became the primary victim of her mother's inexplicable rage. The teenager, whose name has been withheld to protect her memory and surviving siblings, died on what should have been one of the happiest days of the year. The method of her death revealed a level of premeditation that made the crime even more disturbing to investigators. But Villa's violence did not stop with one child. She also attempted to poison her other children, apparently intending to wipe out her entire family. The other children became violently ill, and quick medical intervention saved their lives. Had first responders arrived even minutes later, the death toll could have been catastrophically higher. Emergency services were called to the Villa home after reports of multiple sick children and one unresponsive teenager. Paramedics arrived to find a chaotic scene, children in medical distress and CONNIE Villa behaving erratically. The 13-year-old was already beyond help, having succumbed to the violence inflicted upon her. The surviving children were rushed to the hospital where medical teams worked frantically to save them. Toxicology tests revealed they had been poisoned, though the specific substance was not immediately disclosed to protect the integrity of the ongoing investigation. The children were frightened, confused, and had just lost their sister while fighting for their own lives. Meanwhile, Casa Grande Police Department detectives began piecing together what had happened. CONNIE Villa was taken into custody and questioned extensively. Her responses were inconsistent and at times incoherent, but evidence at the scene painted a clear picture of intentional violence against her own children. The investigation revealed that Villa had obtained the poison used on her children with apparent premeditation. She had planned this attack, choosing Christmas Day, a day when families gather in love, to carry out her murderous scheme. The calculated nature of selecting this particular day added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime. Investigators interviewed family members, neighbors, and anyone who had recent contact with the Villa family. Some reported that CONNIE had seemed stressed and withdrawn in the weeks leading up to Christmas, but no one had suspected she was capable of such violence. Others said they had noticed nothing unusual, making her crimes all the more shocking. The 13-year-old victim was described by those who knew her as a bright, loving young girl with her whole life ahead of her. She had dreams, friends, and a future that was stolen from her by the one person who should have nurtured and protected her. Her death left a permanent scar on the Casa Grande community. As the surviving children recovered physically in the hospital, the psychological trauma they faced was immense. They had lost their sister, nearly lost their own lives, and learned that their mother, the person they trusted most, had been responsible for it all. Child Protective Services immediately became involved to ensure the children's safety and begin the long process of healing. CONNIE Villa was charged with first-degree murder for her daughter's death and multiple counts of attempted murder for the poisoning of her other children. Additional charges were added as prosecutors built their case, including child abuse and endangerment charges that reflected the full scope of her crimes. The trial was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. The surviving children, now in the care of other family members, had to relive the trauma of that horrible Christmas day through testimony and evidence presentation. Their courage in facing their mother in court was remarkable given what they had endured. Prosecutors presented medical evidence showing the cause of the teenager's death and the poisoning of the other children. Expert witnesses testified about the substances involved and the deliberate nature of their administration. The defense had little to offer in response. The evidence was overwhelming and Villa's guilt was clear. The community of Casa Grande rallied around the surviving Villa children, offering support, donations, and love during their darkest hours. Vigils were held for the murdered teenager, with hundreds of people turning out to honor her memory and show solidarity with the family she left behind. When the guilty verdicts were announced, there was a sense of justice being served, though nothing could undo the damage Villa had inflicted. She was convicted of first-degree murder and multiple counts of attempted murder, among other charges. The conviction meant she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. During sentencing, the judge spoke directly about the betrayal of trust that Villa's crimes represented. A mother's role is to protect, nurture, and love her children, yet Villa had done the exact opposite. The judge sentenced Connie Villa to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive years for the attempted murders and other charges. Villa showed little emotion as the sentence was read, maintaining a detached demeanor that had characterized much of her trial appearance. She was led away to begin serving her sentence at an Arizona women's prison facility, where she will remain for the rest of her natural life. The surviving Villa children have worked to rebuild their lives with the help of family members who took them in and mental health professionals who continue to support their healing. They carry the physical and emotional scars of what their mother did, but they also carry the memory of their sister and the determination to honor her life. For Casa Grande, Christmas will never be quite the same. The town where families pride themselves on holiday traditions was forced to confront the reality that even on the holiest of days, evil can strike. The case serves as a reminder to remain vigilant and to reach out when someone seems to be struggling before tragedy occurs. The Villa case also raised important questions about intervention and support for families in crisis. While nothing excuses Connie Villa's actions, the case highlighted the need for better mental health resources and community support systems that might identify at-risk parents before they harm their children. Today, the 13-year-old victim is remembered by her community as a bright light extinguished too soon. Her life mattered, her dreams mattered, and her memory continues to impact those who knew her and even those who only learned of her through this terrible tragedy. Case 4. Samantha Allen and Cynthia Stoltzmann, July 2011, Maricopa County. Some cases are so horrific that they defy comprehension, and the murder of 10-year-old AME Deal is one such case. This was not a crime committed by a stranger or a single individual. It was the result of systematic abuse and torture inflicted by her aunt Samantha Allen, her aunt's husband, and Cynthia Stoltzmann, who played a maternal role in AME's life. The little girl suffered unimaginable cruelty before being locked in a footlocker where she suffocated to death. AME Deal was a vulnerable child living in Phoenix with relatives who should have provided love and protection. Instead, she endured months of escalating abuse that shocked even hardened police investigators when the full extent was revealed. The abuse was not hidden or accidental. It was deliberate, sustained, and involved multiple adults who failed to protect this innocent child. The nightmare for AME began long before the night she died. She was routinely punished for minor infractions with cruel and unusual methods. She was forced to eat hot sauce until she vomited, run outside in the Arizona heat until she collapsed, and endure beatings that left her small body covered in bruises. But the adults in her home were just getting started. Samantha Allen, who was supposed to care for her niece, instead became her tormentor. Along with her husband and Cynthia Stoltzmann, Allen created an environment of terror for AME. The child was treated worse than an animal, denied basic human dignity, and subjected to punishments that escalated in severity as time went on. On the night of July 12, 2011, the abuse reached its fatal conclusion. As punishment for some perceived misdeed, AME Deal was forced into a small plastic footlocker, the kind typically used for storing sports equipment or camping gear. The locker was far too small for a 10-year-old child. AME was locked inside and left there overnight in the sweltering Phoenix heat. Inside that footlocker, AME suffocated. She banged on the sides, crying for help, begging to be let out. The adults in the house heard her cries, but did nothing. They went about their evening, watched television, and went to bed while a little girl died a terrifying death just feet away. By morning, AME was dead. When her body was discovered, the adults initially tried to claim she had locked herself in the footlocker while playing. But investigators quickly saw through this obvious lie. The locker had been padlocked from the outside. AME could not possibly have done this herself. Additionally, the physical evidence of long-term abuse on her body told a story of systematic torture. The Phoenix Police Department launched an intensive investigation into AME's death. Detectives interviewed everyone who had contact with the household and uncovered a pattern of abuse that had been ongoing for months or possibly years. Other children in the home revealed they had witnessed AME's abuse but were too frightened to report it or believe the adults' claims that AME deserved such treatment. Medical examiners documented the extensive injuries on AME's body, old and new bruises, scars from previous punishments, signs of malnutrition, and the physical trauma consistent with being confined in an impossibly small space. The autopsy confirmed she had suffocated in the footlocker, a death that would have been slow and terrifying for a 10-year-old child. As details of AME Deal's suffering became public, the Phoenix community erupted in outrage and grief. How could multiple adults torture a child for so long without anyone intervening? How did teachers, neighbors, and extended family members not notice or report what was happening? These questions haunted everyone who learned of AME's story. Samantha Allen, her husband John Allen, and Cynthia Stoltzmann were all arrested and charged with first-degree murder along with multiple counts of child abuse. The prosecution argued that while John Allen had locked the footlocker that night, all three adults were equally responsible for AME's death due to their pattern of abuse. The trial process was complex because three defendants were involved, each with separate counsel and potentially conflicting defenses. Samantha Allen attempted to shift blame to her husband, claiming she was afraid of him and went along with the abuse out of fear. Cynthia Stoltzmann made similar claims, but the evidence showed both women had actively participated in tormenting AME. Prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence, including medical reports, photographs of AME's injuries, testimony from other children in the home, and expert witnesses who explained the pattern of escalating abuse. The footlocker itself was entered into evidence. A tiny space that jurors could see was impossibly small for a child AME's size. The jury heard heartbreaking testimony about AME's short life. She had been a sweet child, eager to please, who loved school because it was her only escape from the horror of home. Teachers described her as hungry for attention and affection, often coming to school dirty and showing signs of physical abuse that, in hindsight, should have triggered earlier intervention. Samantha Allen was convicted of first-degree murder and child abuse. The jury found that she had participated in the pattern of abuse that led to AME's death and had failed to prevent her husband from locking AME in the footlocker despite knowing the danger. Allen was sentenced to death, becoming one of the few women on Arizona's death row. Cynthia Stoltzmann was also convicted of first-degree murder for her role in AME's death and the abuse leading up to it. She received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. John Allen, Samantha's husband, was also convicted and sentenced to death for actually placing AME in the footlocker and locking it. The case prompted significant changes in Arizona's child welfare system. Lawmakers and advocates pushed for better training for teachers and mandatory reporters, improved investigation protocols for child protective services, and harsher penalties for child abuse. AME's law was discussed as potential legislation to strengthen protections for vulnerable children. For the Phoenix community, AME Deal became a symbol of failure of adults to protect a vulnerable child, a failure of systems designed to identify abuse, and a failure of humanity itself. Vigils were held in her memory, and her case became a rallying cry for better child protection. AME Deal's biological mother, who had lost custody years earlier, expressed devastating grief over her daughter's death. While she had her own struggles that led to Amy being placed with relatives, she never imagined those relatives would torture and murder her child. The guilt and grief she carries will last a lifetime. The surviving children who witnessed Amy's abuse have received extensive counseling and were placed in safer homes. They carry the trauma of what they saw and their inability to save Amy. Mental health professionals continue to work with them to process these experiences and build healthier futures. Samantha Allen and Cynthia Stoltzmann remain in Arizona's prison system, serving their sentences. Allen's death sentence is under appeal, a process that typically takes many years in Arizona. Meanwhile, Amy Deal's memory is preserved by advocates who fight to prevent other children from suffering similar fates. The footlocker that became Amy's tomb stands as evidence of human cruelty. It serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest monsters are not strangers, but family members who betray the sacred trust of caring for a child. Amy Deal deserved love, protection, and the chance to grow up. Instead, she got torture and death from the women who should have been her protectors. Case 5. RETTA CRUSE, February 2021, Maricopa County. In the Phoenix suburb of Chandler, a mother made a decision that would end 2 young lives and ultimately her own. RETTA CRUSE. Overwhelmed by circumstances, investigators are still working to fully understand, drugged and took the lives of her 2 young daughters before being arrested and eventually taking her own life in prison. This case represents a tragic spiral of desperation that ended in unspeakable loss. The investigation began when authorities conducted a welfare check at the CRUSE residence in February of 2021. What they discovered was a scene of unimaginable tragedy. 2 young girls, aged 5 and 7, unresponsive in their beds. Despite immediate medical intervention, both children were pronounced deceased. Their mother, RETTA CRUSE, was found at the scene in a state of emotional collapse. Initial investigation revealed that CRUSE had administered drugs to her daughters, substances that proved fatal to their small bodies. The exact nature of what happened in those final hours remains partially unclear, but evidence suggested CRUSE had made a deliberate decision to end her daughters' lives along with her own, though her own attempt was unsuccessful. RETTA CRUSE was not unknown to the system. Records would later show she had struggled with mental health issues and had sought help at various points. However, the interventions available had not been enough to prevent the tragedy that unfolded. Questions immediately arose about whether warning signs had been missed and if more could have been done to protect the children. Neighbors described the CRUSE family as quiet and largely private. The girls were occasionally seen playing in the yard, and RETTA was observed as a devoted if stressed mother. But behind closed doors, CRUSE was apparently spiraling into a darkness that would culminate in double murder. The Chandler Police Department worked closely with medical examiners to determine exactly what had happened. Toxicology reports revealed the substances found in the children's systems, confirming they had been administered by someone else rather than accidentally ingested. The evidence pointed clearly to RETTA CRUSE as the only person who could have been responsible. CRUSE was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was held without bond as prosecutors prepared their case and investigators continued gathering evidence. CRUSE herself provided limited information during questioning, appearing to be in a state of shock or dissociation from what she had done. The deaths of the 2 young CRUSE sisters devastated the Chandler community. The girls had attended local schools where teachers and classmates remembered them as sweet children. Counseling services were made available to students and staff struggling with the loss. A memorial outside the family home grew with flowers, stuffed animals, and heartfelt messages. As the legal process moved forward, CRUSE's mental state became a central focus. Her defense attorneys argued she had been experiencing a mental health crisis at the time of the murders. Psychiatric evaluations were ordered to determine her competency to stand trial and her mental state at the time of the offense. However, the case would never reach its full legal conclusion. In 2025, while incarcerated in an Arizona facility awaiting trial, RETTA CRUSE took her own life. The news shocked those following the case and left many questions permanently unanswered. What exactly had driven CRUSE to such desperate acts? What could have been done differently to prevent the tragedy? CRUSE's death by her own hand meant that a full trial with complete evidence and testimony would never occur. The families of the two young victims were denied the opportunity to see justice fully served and to understand through trial proceedings exactly what had happened to their beloved granddaughters, nieces, and cousins. Extended family members who survived CRUSE expressed complex emotions: grief for the two innocent children lost, anger at CRUSE for her actions, and sadness that she too had died before answers could be fully obtained. They spoke of how the two girls had been bright lights in the family, full of potential and joy that was extinguished far too soon. The case raised important discussions about maternal mental health and the need for better intervention when mothers show signs of crisis. While CRUSE's actions were ultimately her own responsibility, experts pointed to the need for more accessible and effective mental health services for struggling parents before thoughts turned to violence. Mental health advocates used the CRUSE case to illustrate the sometimes catastrophic consequences when mental illness goes untreated or is inadequately treated. They called for better screening, more intensive intervention programs, and reduced stigma around seeking help for psychological distress. The Chandler School District where the CRUSE children had attended implemented new protocols for identifying students whose families might be in crisis. Teachers received additional training on warning signs and how to connect families with resources. While these changes could not help the CRUSE sisters, officials hoped they might prevent future tragedies. Child welfare agencies also examined the CRUSE case to determine if there had been prior contact with the family and whether intervention opportunities had been missed. While some prior reports had been made, they had not risen to the level that would have resulted in removal of the children from the home, a decision that haunted social workers after the murders. The facility where Retta CRUSE was being held also faced scrutiny regarding how she had been able to take her own life while in custody. Reviews of suicide prevention protocols were conducted, and changes were implemented to better monitor high-risk inmates. The oversight had failed not only CRUSE, but also the public's interest in seeing her face full justice. For the extended CRUSE family, the grief is compounded by the loss of not only two children, but also the answers they deserved. They struggle with complex feelings toward Retta, the woman who gave life to those children but also took it away. Forgiveness seems impossible, yet some family members speak of the Retta they knew before tragedy struck, trying to reconcile that person with the one who committed murder. Today, the two young CRUSE sisters are remembered through scholarships established in their names and through advocacy work aimed at improving mental health services and child protection. Their short lives have become a catalyst for change, even as the pain of their loss remains fresh for those who love them. Case 6. Lori Vallow Daybell. Various dates 2019 to 2020, Maricopa, and other counties. The case of Lori Vallow Daybell captured national attention like few others, becoming one of the most bizarre and disturbing family murder cases in modern American history. While her most infamous acts occurred in Idaho, Lori Vallow's Arizona connections and conspiracy charges related to events in the Grand Canyon state make her case relevant to Arizona's dark history of maternal evil. Lori Vallow Daybell appeared to the world as a devoted mother, a woman of faith, and a loving family member. But beneath this facade lurked a dangerous fanatic whose twisted religious beliefs would lead to the deaths of her own children and others who stood in the way of her apocalyptic visions. Her transformation from mother to murderer shocked everyone who knew her. The Arizona connection to Lori Vallow's crimes centers on the death of her previous husband, Charles Vallow, who was shot and killed in Chandler, Arizona in July of 2019. Charles had grown increasingly concerned about Lori's mental state and her bizarre religious beliefs involving zombies, light and dark spirits, and the end of the world. Charles Vallow was killed by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, who claimed self-defense. At the time, authorities investigated but initially accepted this explanation. However, as Lori's subsequent crimes came to light, the death of Charles Vallow would be re-examined as potentially the first in a series of murders orchestrated by Lori to eliminate obstacles to her twisted plans. Lori had become involved with Chad Daybell, an author of apocalyptic religious fiction who shared and encouraged her extremist beliefs. Together, they developed a worldview in which people could be possessed by dark spirits and become zombies who were better off dead. This belief system would provide Lori with justification for murder. After Charles Vallow's death in Arizona, Lori relocated to Idaho with her two children, Tylee Ryan, 16 years old, and Joshua J.J. VALLOW, 7 years old. The children were last seen alive in September of 2019. Lori and Chad Daybell married shortly after Chad's previous wife died under suspicious circumstances, and the newlyweds moved to Hawaii while family members desperately searched for the missing children. The search for TYLE and JJ became a national news story. Where were these children? Why was their mother refusing to cooperate with police? As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered Lori's disturbing beliefs and the convenient deaths of people who stood between her and Chad Daybell. The case became more sinister with each new revelation. In June of 2020, the worst fears were confirmed. The remains of Tylee Ryan and JJ VALLOW were found buried on Chad Daybell's property in Idaho. The children had been murdered and hidden, their own mother apparently complicit in or directly responsible for their deaths. The nation reacted with horror and outrage. While the murders occurred in Idaho, Arizona authorities had continuing interest in Lori Vallow Daybell's case due to the suspicious death of Charles Vallow in Chandler. Conspiracy charges were filed in Arizona related to Charles' death, as evidence mounted that Lori and possibly others had plotted his murder rather than it being legitimate self-defense, as initially claimed. Alex Cox, Lori's brother who shot Charles Vallow, died himself in December of 2019 in Arizona, officially from natural causes, though the timing raised suspicions. He would never face questions about his role in Charles' death or potential involvement in the children's murders. Some investigators believe Cox may have been poisoned to silence him. The legal proceedings against Lori Vallow Daybell were complex, spanning multiple jurisdictions. In Idaho, she faced charges for the murders of her children TYLE and JJ, as well as conspiracy charges related to the death of Chad Daybell's previous wife, Tammy Daybell. In Arizona, she faced conspiracy charges related to Charles Vallow's death. During court proceedings, Lori Vallow Daybell showed shocking indifference to the charges against her. She smiled and appeared relaxed, seemingly unconcerned about the accusations that she had murdered or conspired to murder multiple people, including her own children. Her behavior troubled observers and suggested either severe mental illness or psychopathy. The prosecution's case was built on substantial evidence. Text messages between Lori and Chad discussing their religious beliefs and rating people as light or dark, financial motives including life insurance policies and Social Security benefits for the children, and testimony from former friends and family members who witnessed Lori's descent into extremism. Lori's defense attempted to argue mental illness, suggesting her religious beliefs had reached delusional levels and she was not fully responsible for her actions. However, prosecutors countered that Lori had been functional enough to plan murders, hide bodies, flee to Hawaii, and lie to investigators, all actions requiring rational thought and calculation. In 2023, Lori Vallow Daybell was convicted in Idaho on multiple murder charges related to her children and Tammy Daybell. She was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. The Arizona charges remained pending, adding additional potential sentences to her already guaranteed lifetime imprisonment. The case of Lori Vallow Daybell became a cautionary tale about religious extremism, the dangers of charismatic manipulation, and the ultimate betrayal of maternal duty. How could a mother who once appeared devoted to her children come to see them as obstacles to be eliminated? The questions haunt everyone who followed the case. Extended family members of the victims, particularly the families of Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow, have suffered immeasurable grief. They have spoken publicly about the children, keeping their memories alive and ensuring they are remembered as the innocent victims they were rather than merely as statistics in a sensational crime story. Charles Vallow's family has also sought justice, pushing for Arizona authorities to fully prosecute the conspiracy charges related to his death. They want accountability not just for Lori, but for anyone else who may have participated in or facilitated the plot to murder Charles. The case exposed failures in systems meant to protect children. Multiple people had reported concerns about Lori's mental state and the children's well-being, yet the children remained in her custody until it was too late. Child Protective Services, law enforcement, and the family court system all faced criticism for not acting more decisively. Mental health professionals have debated whether Lori Vallow Daybell is genuinely mentally ill or simply evil. Her ability to function, plan, and manipulate suggests she understood right from wrong and chose wrong anyway. Yet her beliefs were undeniably extreme and divorced from reality. The debate continues about where mental illness ends and culpability begins. The religious community Lori was part of, including mainstream members of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, were quick to distance themselves from her extremist interpretations. Church leaders emphasized that Lori's beliefs about zombies and dark spirits were not church doctrine and represented a dangerous perversion of faith. Chad Daybell, Lori's husband and apparent co-conspirator, was also convicted and sentenced to death in Idaho for his role in the murders. The couple, who claimed to be preparing for the end of the world, instead brought about the end of innocent lives and their own freedom. Both will die in prison, never experiencing the apocalyptic visions they claimed to foresee. For Arizona, the Lori Vallow Daybell case serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind smiles, religious devotion, and apparent maternal love. Her crimes, which began in the Grand Canyon state with the death of Charles Vallow, eventually led to a trail of bodies and broken families that will never fully heal. The children, Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow, are remembered through foundations established in their names, advocacy for child protection reform, and the determination of family members to ensure their lives mattered beyond the terrible way they ended. They deserved a mother who would protect them, but instead they got one who saw them as expendable. Today, Lori Vallow Daybell sits in an Idaho prison serving life without parole, with Arizona charges still pending that could add symbolic, if not practical, additional time. Her case will be studied for years by criminologists, psychologists, and anyone seeking to understand how a mother can become a monster. Case 7. Brandie GOTCH, August 2017, Maricopa County. Not all maternal violence results in death, but the terror inflicted can be no less profound. In Peoria, Arizona, Brandie GOTCH committed an act of violence so shocking that it traumatized an entire neighborhood and could have easily resulted in multiple child fatalities. In an apparent fit of rage, she drove a truck directly at children playing in a park, injuring one and terrorizing others in what witnesses described as an attempt to run them down. The incident occurred on an August afternoon in 2017 at a Peoria neighborhood park where children often gathered to play. It was a typical summer day with kids enjoying the remaining weeks before school resumed. Parents watched from nearby benches or homes, comfortable in the assumption that a public park in broad daylight was a safe place for their children. They were wrong. Brandie GOTCH arrived at the park driving a pickup truck. According to witnesses and subsequent investigation, she appeared agitated and was seen arguing with people in the area. What happened next was barely comprehensible. GOTCH drove her truck across the grass directly toward a group of children playing in the park. Witnesses screamed warnings and children scattered in terror as the truck barreled toward them. Most managed to dive out of the way, but a 12-year-old girl was struck by the vehicle and injured. The child was rushed to the hospital with injuries that, while serious, miraculously were not fatal. She would survive, but the physical and psychological trauma would leave permanent scars. The scene was chaotic in the immediate aftermath. Parents rushed to their children, some of whom were crying and screaming in fear. The injured 12-year-old was being attended to by adults who had witnessed the attack. Brandie GOTCH remained in the area, apparently unconcerned about the terror and harm she had just inflicted. Peoria Police Department officers arrived quickly and took GOTCH into custody. She was aggressive and uncooperative during her arrest, showing no remorse for having just driven a truck at children in a deliberate act of violence. Officers had to restrain her to get her into the patrol vehicle safely. Investigations revealed that GOTCH had a history of erratic and violent behavior. She had previous run-ins with law enforcement and a pattern of aggressive conduct toward others. Mental health issues and substance abuse were factors in her history, though neither would excuse the deliberate act of driving a truck at children. The investigation also examined GOTCH's relationship to the children at the park. She was not a stranger. She had connections to the neighborhood and knew some of the families. This made her attack even more disturbing. It was not a random act by someone unknown to the community, but a violent assault by someone who should have been safe around these children. The 12-year-old victim faced a difficult recovery. Beyond her physical injuries, she developed anxiety about being outside, nightmares about the attack, and fear of vehicles. Her parents spoke publicly about their daughter's trauma and their own struggle to understand how someone could deliberately try to harm children. The emotional impact on the entire family was severe. Other children who witnessed the attack or narrowly avoided being hit also required counseling. Some developed post-traumatic stress symptoms, while others became fearful of parks and public spaces. What should have been a safe childhood environment became associated with terror and violence because of Brandie Gottsch's actions. Parents in the neighborhood expressed outrage and fear. If someone could drive a truck at children in a public park in broad daylight, what other violence might their kids face? The sense of safety that characterizes suburban neighborhoods was shattered. Some families moved away, unable to feel comfortable in a place where such horror had occurred. Brandie Gottsch was charged with multiple serious offenses including aggravated assault, endangerment, and assault with a deadly weapon, the truck. Prosecutors sought significant prison time, arguing that GOTCH represented an ongoing danger to the community, particularly to children. During court proceedings, Gottsch's defense attorneys attempted to introduce evidence of mental health issues and substance abuse problems, suggesting these factors had impaired her judgment. However, witnesses testified that Gottsch's actions appeared deliberate and purposeful. She had steered the truck directly at the children, not in an erratic manner suggesting impairment, but in a targeted way suggesting intent to harm. The prosecution presented testimony from traumatized children who described their terror as the truck came toward them. Parents testified about the impact on their families. Medical professionals described the injuries sustained by the 12-year-old victim and the ongoing treatment she required both physically and psychologically. The jury found Brandie Gottsch guilty on multiple counts. The evidence was overwhelming. Numerous witnesses, physical evidence from the scene, and Gottsch's own behavior during and after the attack all pointed to deliberate violent conduct. The guilty verdicts brought some measure of justice for the victims and their families. During sentencing, the judge spoke about the vulnerability of children and the particular heinousness of using a vehicle as a weapon against them. The judge noted that only luck and the quick reactions of children had prevented multiple fatalities. Gottsch was sentenced to substantial prison time, ensuring she would not be free to harm children again for many years. Brandie Gottsch was remanded to the Arizona Department of Corrections to serve her sentence. Her case became a reference point for discussions about protecting children in public spaces and the need for intervention when individuals with violent histories pose potential threats to communities. The Peoria park where the attack occurred was rededicated in a community ceremony emphasizing safety, healing, and resilience. Additional safety measures were implemented, though no physical barrier could fully restore the sense of security that GOTCH had destroyed. The community came together to support affected families and to reclaim their neighborhood from fear. For the 12-year-old victim, the road to recovery has been long and difficult. Years after the attack, she still bears physical reminders of what happened and continues to work through the psychological trauma. Her family has been vocal about the lasting impact of violent crime on victims, advocating for longer sentences and better mental health intervention before violence occurs. The case of Brandie Gottsch, while not resulting in death, illustrates that maternal violence can take many forms. Whether GOTCH is technically considered a maternal figure to all the children she endangered or not, her willingness to harm children was profound and unforgivable. Her actions that August day could have easily resulted in multiple child fatalities. Today, Brandie Gottsch remains incarcerated in Arizona serving her sentence. The children she terrorized are growing up, working to overcome the trauma she inflicted. The community has largely healed but will never forget the day that violence came to their neighborhood park in the form of a woman driving a truck at their children. Case 8. Lisa Cunningham, October 2014, Maricopa County. The Phoenix metropolitan area has been the site of numerous heartbreaking child abuse cases, but few have been as disturbing as the fatal abuse that led to charges against Lisa Cunningham, a stepmother accused of actions that resulted in the death of her stepdaughter. While step-parents can be loving and devoted, this case represents the dark side, a parental figure who inflicted harm rather than providing care. The case came to light in October of 2014 when emergency services were called to a Phoenix home for an unresponsive child. Paramedics arrived to find a young girl in critical condition with injuries consistent with severe physical abuse. Despite heroic efforts by medical teams, the child could not be saved. She died as a result of the trauma inflicted upon her small body. Lisa Cunningham was the child's stepmother and had been responsible for the girl's care. Initial statements from Cunningham about how the child was injured did not match the medical evidence. Doctors who examined the child found injuries inconsistent with the explanations provided, injuries that indicated deliberate abuse rather than accidents. The Phoenix Police Department opened a death investigation that quickly focused on Cunningham as the primary suspect. Detectives interviewed family members, neighbors, and anyone who had recent contact with the household. What emerged was a pattern of concerning behavior and possible prior abuse that had either gone unreported or uninvestigated. Medical examiners conducted an autopsy that revealed the full extent of the child's injuries. She had sustained trauma over a period of time, not just in one incident. There were old bruises alongside new injuries, indicating ongoing abuse. The cause of death was directly related to blunt force trauma, and the manner of death was ruled a homicide. The child's biological mother, who was not living with the family at the time, was devastated to learn of her daughter's death and the circumstances surrounding it. She expressed guilt and anguish, questioning whether she could have done more to protect her child from the abuse that ultimately killed her. The grief and guilt would burden her for the rest of her life. Lisa Cunningham was arrested and charged with serious felonies including first-degree murder and child abuse. Prosecutors alleged that Cunningham had systematically abused the child and finally inflicted injuries so severe that they proved fatal. The charges reflected the serious nature of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim. The investigation also examined the role of the child's biological father, who had been living in the home where the abuse occurred. Questions arose about what he knew and why he had not protected his daughter. While Cunningham was identified as the primary perpetrator, authorities also looked at whether others had failed to intervene or report the abuse. As the case proceeded through the court system, disturbing details emerged about the child's final months. She had shown signs of abuse that should have been apparent to teachers, medical professionals, or others who encountered her. The failure of mandatory reporters or family members to identify and report the abuse represented a systemic breakdown in child protection. The prosecution built their case around medical evidence, expert testimony about child abuse patterns, and statements from witnesses who had seen the child's condition deteriorate. They painted a picture of escalating violence that culminated in the fatal injuries. Cunningham's own statements and behavior after the child's death were also used as evidence of consciousness of guilt. Cunningham's defense attorneys faced the challenge of explaining away overwhelming physical evidence of abuse and death. They attempted to introduce alternative theories about how the injuries occurred, but medical experts testified that the pattern and severity of injuries were consistent only with intentional abuse, not accidents or natural causes. The trial was emotionally difficult for everyone involved. Testimony about the child's injuries and final hours was heartbreaking. Family members who testified about their loss struggled to maintain composure. Jurors appeared visibly affected by the evidence presented, particularly photographs and medical testimony about what the child had endured. The child's biological mother attended the trial, wanting to be present for her daughter and to see justice served. Her presence in the courtroom served as a painful reminder of the permanent loss caused by Cunningham's actions. Other family members also attended, united in their grief and their desire for accountability. When the verdicts were read, Lisa Cunningham was found guilty on multiple charges related to the abuse and death of her stepdaughter. The jury concluded that the evidence proved beyond reasonable doubt that Cunningham had deliberately harmed the child and caused her death. The guilty verdicts brought some measure of justice, though nothing could undo the tragedy. During sentencing, the judge heard victim impact statements from family members whose lives had been forever altered by the loss of this young girl. They spoke of a bright, loving child whose life was cut short by violence from someone who should have protected her. Their grief was palpable and their desire for maximum punishment clear. The judge sentenced Lisa Cunningham to a substantial prison term reflecting the severity of her crimes. While specific sentencing details may vary based on legal proceedings and appeals, Cunningham faces decades behind bars for taking the life of an innocent child. She will spend the majority, if not all, of her remaining years in an Arizona prison. The case prompted renewed calls for better training of mandatory reporters and more aggressive investigation of suspected child abuse. Advocates pointed out that warning signs had apparently been present but were not acted upon in time to save the child's life. Improvements in the system came too late for this victim, but might protect future children. For the child's biological mother and other family members, grief is compounded by unanswered questions. How much did the child suffer? Was she scared? Did she call out for her mother? These painful questions haunt those who loved her and can never be fully answered. They are left to imagine her fear and pain, a psychological burden that will never lift. The Phoenix community, which has seen too many cases of fatal child abuse, rallied around the memory of this young victim. Her name was spoken at vigils and community gatherings focused on child protection. While her identity has been protected in some reporting, those who knew her ensure she is remembered as more than a statistic. Lisa Cunningham remains in custody, serving her sentence. Her case is occasionally referenced in training for social workers, teachers, and others who work with children as an example of the importance of recognizing and reporting abuse. If those around this child had acted sooner, her life might have been saved. Today, the child's grave is visited by family members who bring flowers and toys, maintaining a connection to a little girl they loved and lost. They work to preserve her memory and to advocate for changes that might prevent other children from suffering similar fates. Their grief is permanent, but so is their determination to find meaning in tragedy. Case 9. RAQUEL Barreras, March 2014, Pima County. In Tucson, Arizona, a horror unfolded over months as RAQUEL Barreras systematically starved her 3-year-old son to death and then hid his tiny body in a toy chest for over a year. This case of extreme neglect and abuse shocked southern Arizona and revealed the darkest possibilities of maternal failure. The boy's name was Roman Barreras, and his short life was defined by suffering at the hands of the person who should have protected him most. Roman Barreras should have been a thriving toddler, learning, playing, and growing. Instead, he was confined, neglected, and literally starved to death while his mother Raquel went about her life. The systematic nature of his murder, because that is what fatal starvation of a child truly is, made this one of the most disturbing cases southern Arizona had ever seen. The discovery of Roman's remains occurred when authorities conducted a welfare check at the Barreras residence in March of 2014. They were looking for Roman, whose absence from school and from view had finally been reported by concerned individuals. What they found in a toy chest would haunt investigators forever. Inside that toy chest was Roman's skeletal remains, hidden there for over a year after his death. The child had been reduced to bones, his tiny skeleton telling a story of malnutrition and neglect so severe that it resulted in death. Medical examiners determined Roman had literally been starved to death, denied the basic sustenance necessary for life. RAQUEL Barreras had concealed her son's death for more than a year, hiding his body while continuing to live in the home. She had not reported him missing, had not sought medical help when he was still alive, and had not provided him with the food necessary to survive. The systematic denial of nutrition to a helpless child represented a form of torture that was almost incomprehensible. The investigation revealed that Roman had been increasingly isolated in the months before his death. Barreras had kept him confined and away from others who might notice his deteriorating condition. As he grew weaker from starvation, she simply watched him waste away rather than providing food or seeking help. Medical examiners could determine from Roman's remains that he had suffered prolonged malnutrition before death. His bones showed signs of growth interruption and the physical markers of starvation. He had suffered for weeks or months, slowly dying from lack of food, while his mother ignored his needs and his pain. Neighbors and extended family members expressed shock and horror when Roman's death was discovered. Some reported they had not seen him in a long time, but had accepted Barreras's explanations about him staying with relatives or being elsewhere. Others admitted they had wondered about his absence, but had not pushed the issue or contacted authorities. The Tucson Police Department built a methodical case against RAQUEL Barreras. They gathered evidence about when Roman was last seen alive, documented the condition of his remains, and interviewed everyone who had contact with the family. The case file grew to include heartbreaking details about the little boy's final months. Barreras was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, child abuse, and concealing a body. Prosecutors argued that denying a child food until they starve to death is unquestionably murder, and the concealment of the body demonstrated consciousness of guilt and an attempt to evade justice for her crime. The case proceeded through the Pima County court system, with Barreras facing potential life imprisonment if convicted. Her defense attorneys had few options given the overwhelming evidence of Roman's starvation death and the concealment of his body in the family home. Claims of mental illness or inability to care for the child rang hollow given she had managed every other aspect of her life. During court proceedings, the prosecution presented medical evidence showing the progression of Roman's starvation and the timeline of his death. Expert witnesses testified about what the child would have experienced: the constant hunger, the weakness, the pain of his body consuming itself for energy, and finally the system shutdown that resulted in death. The case devastated the Tucson community, and particularly those who had known Roman, even briefly. A 3-year-old child had been tortured to death through deliberate starvation, and his death had been hidden for over a year. The betrayal of maternal duty could not have been more complete or more cruel. Raquel Barreras was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and related charges. The jury found that she had intentionally caused Roman's death by denying him food, and that this constituted premeditated murder. The conviction carried a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, the judge spoke about Roman as an individual whose life mattered and whose suffering deserved recognition. The judge described Barreras's actions as among the most heinous forms of child abuse, the deliberate starvation of a helpless child who depended entirely on her for survival. The sentence reflected the severity of her crime and ensured she would never harm another child. Raquel Barreras showed little emotion during sentencing, maintaining a detached demeanor that troubled observers. She offered no real explanation for why she had starved her son or why she had hidden his body rather than seeking help. Her silence left many questions unanswered and denied Roman even the acknowledgement of what she had done to him. The case prompted examinations of how a child could disappear from view long enough to starve to death without intervention. Roman had apparently fallen through multiple safety nets: family members who did not follow up on his whereabouts, educational systems that did not aggressively pursue truancy, and social services that might have checked on the family but did not. Advocacy groups used Roman Barreras's case to push for better tracking of vulnerable children and more aggressive intervention when children disappear from school or other regular activities. They argued that Roman's death was preventable if systems had been more robust and if people had acted on their suspicions when he vanished from sight. For Roman, there would be no future, no chance to overcome the terrible start he had been given in life. His short existence had been marked by neglect and suffering that finally ended in death by starvation. His memory is preserved by those who advocate for abused children, working to ensure no other child suffers a similar fate. Raquel Barreras remains in an Arizona prison where she will spend the rest of her life. Her name has become synonymous with maternal betrayal in southern Arizona. The toy chest where she hid Roman's body stands as evidence of her crime and a physical reminder of the extreme abuse that led to his death. Today, Roman Barreras is remembered through child advocacy efforts and memorials established by the Tucson community. His grave is marked and visited by people who never knew him in life, but who were moved by the tragedy of his death and determined to honor his memory by protecting other vulnerable children. The case serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest danger to children comes from within their own homes, from the very people charged with their care. Roman Barreras deserved love, food, safety, and the chance to grow up. Instead, he got starvation, neglect, and death from his own mother. Case 10. JERICE Hunter, April 2011, Maricopa County. The final case in our examination of Arizona's most evil mothers is that of JERICE Hunter, a Phoenix woman convicted of beating, neglecting, and confining her 5-year-old daughter until the child died from her injuries in 2011. This case of extreme abuse represents the ultimate failure of maternal instinct and the horrible reality that sometimes mothers become monsters who torture their own children. JERICE Hunter's 5-year-old daughter should have been starting kindergarten, learning to read, and experiencing childhood joys. Instead, she was living a nightmare of abuse that would ultimately claim her life. The child, whose identity has been protected in some reporting, suffered extreme physical abuse and neglect at the hands of her mother over an extended period. The abuse came to light in April of 2011 when the child was found unresponsive in the family's Phoenix home. Emergency responders were called, but the little girl was already deceased when they arrived. The condition of her body immediately indicated this was not a natural death or simple accident. This child had been severely abused. Medical examiners documented extensive injuries consistent with prolonged physical abuse. The child had been beaten repeatedly, suffering injuries at various stages of healing that demonstrated the abuse had occurred over time. She also showed signs of severe neglect, including malnutrition and poor hygiene. The cumulative effect of the abuse and neglect had resulted in her death. The investigation revealed that JERICE Hunter had not only beaten her daughter, but had also confined her in inhumane conditions. The child had been isolated, denied adequate food, and subjected to physical punishment that far exceeded any legitimate discipline. Neighbors later reported sometimes hearing crying or screaming from the home, but had not realized the severity of what was occurring. JERICE Hunter was arrested and charged with multiple serious felonies, including first-degree murder and child abuse. Prosecutors built a case showing that Hunter had systematically tortured her 5-year-old daughter, inflicting injuries that accumulated until they proved fatal. The evidence included medical documentation, photographs of the crime scene, and testimony from witnesses. During the investigation, detectives worked to understand what could drive a mother to such extreme abuse of her own child. Hunter's background was examined for mental health issues, substance abuse, or other factors that might explain her behavior. While some issues were identified, nothing could excuse the level of violence she had inflicted on a helpless child. The Phoenix Police Department also examined whether others in the household had participated in or failed to stop the abuse. The role of other adults who had contact with the family was scrutinized to determine if anyone else should face criminal charges for failing to protect the child or for participating in the abuse. As details of the case became public, the Phoenix community reacted with outrage and grief. Another child had been tortured to death in their city, killed by her own mother in what should have been a safe home. Vigils were held for the 5-year-old victim, with strangers mourning a little girl they had never met, but whose suffering touched their hearts. The trial process was lengthy and emotionally challenging. The prosecution presented detailed medical evidence about the child's injuries and the cause of death. Expert witnesses testified about child abuse patterns and explained how the injuries documented on the victim were consistent with deliberate, repeated violence rather than accidents. Defense attorneys for JERICE Hunter faced the difficult task of representing someone accused of torturing their own child to death. They attempted to introduce mitigating factors about Hunter's life circumstances and mental state, but the evidence of what she had done to her daughter was overwhelming and difficult to counter with any sympathy. The jury heard heartbreaking testimony about the child's short life and terrible death. They saw photographs and medical evidence that made clear the extent of suffering this 5-year-old had endured. The deliberations were thorough as jurors carefully considered the evidence, but the conclusion was inevitable given the overwhelming proof of Hunter's guilt. JERICE Hunter was found guilty of first-degree murder and multiple counts of child abuse. The verdicts reflected the jury's conclusion that Hunter had intentionally inflicted fatal injuries on her daughter and had abused her over an extended period. Justice was being served, though it came too late for the child who had suffered and died. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors argued for the maximum possible penalty. They presented victim impact statements from extended family members who had loved the child and were devastated by her death. The statements painted a picture of a sweet little girl whose potential had been destroyed by her mother's violence. The judge sentenced JERICE Hunter to multiple decades to life in prison, ensuring she would likely never be released. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and the particular heinousness of a mother torturing her own child to death. Hunter was remanded to the Arizona Department of Corrections, where she remains today. The case prompted renewed discussions about identifying and intervening in child abuse situations before they turn fatal. The 5-year-old victim had shown signs of abuse that might have been noticed by teachers, medical professionals, or others if she had been in their care. The isolation that facilitated her abuse might have been broken if systems had been more vigilant. Child welfare agencies examined their protocols and procedures in light of the Hunter case, looking for ways to better identify at-risk children and intervene before abuse becomes fatal. While these improvements came too late for Hunter's victim, officials hoped they might save future children from similar fates. For the extended family of the murdered child, grief is compounded by guilt and unanswered questions. Could they have done more? Were there signs they missed? How much did the child suffer? These painful questions haunt surviving family members who struggle to understand how JERICE Hunter could have harmed her own daughter so terribly. The Phoenix community, which has seen too many cases of fatal child abuse, marked the loss of this 5-year-old with memorials and renewed commitment to child protection. Her case became another tragic example of why vigilance is necessary and why reporting suspected abuse is crucial. JERICE Hunter remains incarcerated in Arizona, serving her lengthy sentence. She will likely die in prison, never again free to harm a child. Her case is referenced in training materials for professionals who work with children and in advocacy efforts aimed at preventing child abuse fatalities. Today, the 5-year-old victim is remembered by those who loved her and by a community that mourns all children lost to abuse. Her short life matters, not just as a tragedy, but as a catalyst for improved child protection efforts. She deserved so much better than what she got from the mother who should have loved and protected her. Conclusion. These 10 cases represent some of the most disturbing instances of maternal evil in Arizona's history. From INOUE's brutal murder of her 2 children with a meat cleaver to JERICE Hunter's fatal abuse of her 5-year-old daughter, these stories shock the conscience and challenge our understanding of maternal instinct. Each case is unique, yet patterns emerge. Many of these mothers showed signs of mental health struggles, substance abuse, or overwhelming stress. Some had extremist beliefs or personality disorders. But ultimately, each made a choice to harm rather than help, to destroy rather than protect, to become murderers rather than mothers. The victims, innocent children who trusted the adults who should have cared for them, deserve to be remembered not just as statistics, but as individual lives cut short. They had personalities, dreams, and potential that was stolen from them by maternal violence. Their memories must be preserved and honored. These cases also highlight systemic failures. Warning signs were missed, reports went uninvestigated, and interventions came too late. While we cannot prevent all violence, we can learn from these tragedies to build better systems for identifying and helping at-risk families before abuse turns fatal. If you know a child who might be in danger, please contact local authorities or call the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. Your call could save a life. Every child deserves safety, love, and the chance to grow up. This has been Cold Case Hour, examining the most evil mothers in Arizona. Thank you for watching this difficult but important content. If you found this documentary informative and well-researched, please give us a thumbs up, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss our deep dive investigations into true crime cases. Your support helps us continue bringing you thoroughly researched, respectful coverage of these important stories. Remember, by educating ourselves about these tragedies, we honor the victims and empower ourselves to protect the vulnerable children in our communities. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and we'll see you in the next Cold Case Hour.